In the quiet mist of the Highlands, a single flicker in Hamish Macbeth's window sparks a mystery the village would rather ignore. And tonight, you're stepping right into the heart of it with me. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery.
The drizzle had settled in early, the thin kind that never quite turned into rain but made the air taste damp and metallic. Hamish walked slowly along the loch road with Lugs padding beside him, the dog's coat already speckled with moisture. The light was fading, though it wasn't yet evening, and the horizon beyond the hills looked smudged, as if someone had smeared the sky with a wet cloth. It suited Hamish's mood. His sleep had been poor the past few nights, and the quiet of the loch road helped settle the thoughts he could never quite describe, even to himself. The Crofters were shutting their sheds early. Old Donald McRae gave Hamish a nod before disappearing inside, pulling the door behind him with a familiar creak. From Patel's shop, the weak flicker of the neon sign stuttered against the window, reflected in small quivering shapes across the puddles in the road. Lugs stopped to sniff at a dwindling rowan branch, then huffed as though unimpressed by the scent of damp leaves. Hamish might have continued on, content with the soft shush of water brushing the stones at the edge of the loch, had Torrin MacLean not appeared out of the grey. The old crofter came with a hurried, uneven gait, his cap askew, his face paler than usual beneath the bush of his white eyebrows. "Hamish," he whispered, though no one else was near, "you'll not believe what I saw." Hamish gave him a gentle smile. Torrin often arrived with stories, some true, some not, all told with earnest worry. "Evening, Torrin. What's the matter now?" Torrin glanced over his shoulder, then stepped closer. Lugs lifted his head, ears pricking forward. "Last night," Torrin said, voice trembling despite the still air, "I saw a light burning in your bedroom window. A lantern, plain as day, moving about inside." Hamish blinked, surprised but keeping his tone mild. "My window? Are you certain?" "I ken your cottage well enough," Torrin said sharply, offended that Hamish might doubt him. "Light swung across the ceiling. Aye, I saw it. But you weren't home, were you?" "No," Hamish admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Lugs and I were on the moors for a bit. Couldn't sleep." Torrin swallowed, shifting his weight. "Then who was in your room?" Hamish tried to soothe the fear. "Might have been a trick of light. Mist does strange things." He glanced at the Crofter's trembling hands. "You know how it can be after dark." But Torrin only shook his head. "It was no trick. I watched long enough to be certain." Lugs growled, soft, barely audible, but enough for Hamish to feel a small knot tighten in his stomach. He put a hand on the dog's back, murmuring something reassuring that didn't reassure him at all. "I'll have a look," he said gently. "Dinna worry yourself." Torrin didn't look convinced. His eyes darted once more toward the hills before he muttered, "Take care, Hamish," and hurried off, his boots making faint splashes as he disappeared into the fog. Hamish lingered on the road a moment, watching the crofter vanish. Lugs pressed against his leg, sensing the tension. The loch felt unusually quiet, the drizzle thickening, swallowing sound. Hamish shook off the feeling and turned back toward the village. At the post office, the Curry sisters were just locking up. Jessie Curry spotted him instantly. "Hamish, did you hear? Torrin claims your house is haunted." Hamish sighed. He didn't say that. "Close enough," Nessie chimed in, her scarf wrapped primly around her neck. "Light in your window, Hamish. Folk are talking already." "Folk talk before they think," Hamish said dryly. But their sharp, eager expressions told him gossip had already taken root. It always did. He walked on, passing the Kirk Hall where a few lingering members of the knitting club stared out at him through misted windows. Patel stepped outside his shop just long enough to nod respectfully before retreating again. Hamish knew the whispering would grow by morning. That was simply how Lochtub worked. Secrets didn't stay quiet. They drifted on the same wind that carried the smell of peat fires through the village. When Hamish reached his cottage, everything looked ordinary. The thatched roof glistened with moisture, and the narrow windows were dark. Inside, the air was cold, carrying the faint scent of damp wool and peat ash from the fire he'd let die the night before. Nothing appeared disturbed. His bedroom was exactly as he'd left it. Bed unmade, a shirt draped over a chair, a mug with dried tea at the bottom sitting crooked on the windowsill. "Nothing here," Hamish murmured, though Lugs sniffed the air with restless caution. The dog circled the room twice before settling uneasily by the door. Hamish checked the windows twice, then pulled the curtains shut. The cottage had always been untidy, the clutter of books, jackets, and mismatched crockery part of his life. But tonight he felt a faint unease, as though something had shifted in the space without leaving any mark. He brewed tea, standing with his back to the stove while the kettle hissed. The poor phone line crackled before he even finished dialing Strathbane. It took 3 attempts before someone answered. "Police headquarters, Sergeant Blair speaking." Hamish felt his patience sag. "It's Macbeth. There might have been a trespass at my cottage." "Aye, I'm sure it's nothing," Blair interrupted loudly. "Probably left your window open like the incompetent fool ye are." Hamish kept his tone mild. "I never mentioned the window." Blair made a dismissive noise. "We've real crimes to handle. Dinna bother us with your village nonsense." The line crackled again before Blair hung up without another word. Hamish let the receiver rest in his hand for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the empty line. He put it back slowly, resisting the impulse to mutter something unkind. Blair wasn't worth the breath. He carried his tea to the armchair by the cold hearth. Lugs climbed onto the rug, though instead of curling beside Hamish's feet as usual, he lay facing the front door, ears half alert. Hamish frowned. "What's gotten into you tonight, eh?" Lugs didn't move. The drizzle outside quickened against the windows, sounding like fingertips drumming faintly along the glass. Hamish drank his tea slowly, letting the warmth settle into him. The village outside had gone quiet, the usual distant sounds muffled by the damp air. He stared at the unlit fireplace and sighed. "I should light it," he said aloud, but he didn't stand. His thoughts drifted back to Torrin. The fear in the old crofter's eyes wasn't the world-weariness of an aging man. It had been something sharper, something that didn't sit well with Hamish's understanding of Torrin, who complained often but rarely worried. Hamish set the empty mug aside and walked to the bedroom window. He pushed aside the curtain and looked out. The drizzle blurred the shape of the loch, smearing the lamplight from the village into faint halos. Nothing moved. No lantern light flickered in any window along the road. There was only the soft, unbroken grey of another Highland evening. Still, he couldn't shrug off Torrin's words. He checked the lock on the door once more. Lugs followed him to the bedroom, but refused to take his usual place on the bed. Instead, the dog trotted back to the front door, circling twice before settling down against it stubbornly. Hamish watched him for a moment. "Suit yourself," he murmured, "but you're making me uneasy." He climbed into bed, the sheets cold against his skin. The drizzle tapped on the window, steady and repetitive. As he closed his eyes, Hamish had the quiet, certain feeling that Torrin had indeed seen something real enough to disturb a man not easily shaken. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, listening to Lugs breathe in low, alert huffs from the hallway. The cottage felt still, but not empty. The drizzle thickened, the night pressed close, and Hamish knew, with the kind of intuition he never talked about, that something in Lochdub had shifted, something small, but enough to unsettle the village in ways no light should have. The morning mist rolled down from the hills as if the night had grown weary and settled along the ground to rest. It muffled the village lanes, softening the edges of the cottages until they looked like shapes half-remembered in a dream. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of his station house with Lugs at his side, pulling his old jacket closed against the chill. The poor sleep of the previous night clung to him, leaving a heaviness in his limbs that even the cold air couldn't quite shake. Lugs nudged his knee, sensing the unease that lingered beneath Hamish's outward quiet. The road to Torrin MacLean's croft wound along a low stone wall topped with damp moss. Sheep bleated somewhere in the mist, their shapes hidden behind it. Hamish kept his pace measured. Worry did no good, and Torrin had always been prone to restlessness. Still, something in the crofter's frightened eyes the evening before had stayed with him. Hamish wasn't a man who frightened easily, but he trusted instinct, and instinct told him Torrin's fear had come from somewhere real. Lugs tugged slightly on the lead, impatient to move quicker. "Aye, I know," Hamish murmured. "We're going." His voice sounded flat in the cold air. He adjusted his step, letting the dog guide him toward the croft. When the small structure appeared from the mist, Hamish felt a faint tightening in his chest. The croft's door stood ajar, rocking gently with each faint push of wind. Peat smoke clung to the cold, but only as a fading trace, like a memory left too long. Lugs growled low, the sound rumbling in his chest. Hamish called out, "Torrin?" His voice carried only a short distance before sinking into the fog. No reply came. Inside, the croft was dim. The small window offered little light. Torrens' chair still held a folded blanket, and the hearth contained the remnants of a fire burned down to a few blackened clumps of peat. On the floor near the chair lay a cracked peat lamp. The brittle edge had snapped cleanly, suggesting it had fallen recently. Hamish crouched, examining the floor. The earth near the doorway bore faint marks. Something dragged or pulled, but not forcefully, as if someone with unsteady footing had lost balance. He followed the impressions to the threshold, where they faded in the muddied earth outside. Lugg sniffed the ground, then pressed forward, leading Hamish toward the loch path. The mist thickened here, curling low around the reeds. Hamish's boots made soft thuds in the wet soil. "Easy, Lugs," he whispered, though the dog was tense, ears perked. Voices drifted from behind him, hushed and uncertain. A handful of villagers had gathered at a distance, crofters heading to morning chores, a fisher with nets draped over his shoulder, Mrs. Barclay from the post office clutching her shawl. They looked at Hamish with a mixture of worry and something else, something that resembled embarrassment rather than fear. "Is he no inside?" Mrs. Barclay asked, stepping forward. Her breath puffed in little white clouds. "No sign of him," Hamish said quietly. "That man's always wandering off," muttered a crofter, trying to sound casual but failing. "He gets notions in his head." "Aye, and sometimes strong ones," another said, though the quick glance he exchanged with a neighbour told Hamish that the village knew more than it wanted to admit. Hamish straightened, brushing damp soil from his hands. "Did any of you see him this morning?" They shuffled uncomfortably. No one met his gaze. Lugs paced in front of Hamish, restless. "If Torrens had trouble," Hamish continued, his voice soft, "I'd appreciate hearing of it." Still silence. Then Mrs. Barclay said in a hesitant tone, "He mentioned having visitors last night. Folk he didn't expect, but he wouldn't say who." Hamish's mind stirred. Torren had been afraid enough to speak of lights in Hamish's own cottage. Now there were unexpected visitors? The pieces didn't sit right. "Aye, well," muttered the fisher, "maybe he's just wandered down the loch path. The fog's thick enough to make a man lose direction." Hamish didn't respond. He let the villagers remain with their half-truths. They often hid their guilt behind polite evasion. Sometimes they believed a small lie was better than a troublesome truth. He walked on, leaving the group behind. The drag-like impressions grew harder to see, the earth too muddied from the night's moisture. Near the loch's edge, Lugs froze, sniffing a patch of flattened reeds. Hamish crouched and touched the stems. Something, or someone, had pressed them recently. The loch itself lay silent, dark water barely shifting except for the faint ripple of a faint, far-off breeze. Hamish stood still, listening. Only the gentle lap of water met his ears. "Torren," he murmured under his breath. It wasn't prayer, but something close to quiet hope. He lingered a while, scanning the shoreline, but no body drifted near the reeds, and the stones held no signs of panic or struggle. Whatever had happened, the scene had gone quiet. By mid-morning, Hamish and Lugs headed to Patel's shop. The mist had lifted slightly, though the sky remained a heavy grey. Patel stood behind the counter, arranging tins with his usual tidy precision. He nodded at Hamish with polite respect. "Morning, Constable. You're out early." "Looking for Torren," Hamish replied. "He's not been home." Patel hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "He came by late last night. Strange for him. Bought matches, a lantern wick, and a packet of those fancy biscuits he always says are too dear for crofters." "What did he say?" Hamish asked. "That he meant to keep awake. Said he had something to watch for." Patel adjusted his glasses. "I didn't press him. He looked troubled." Hamish didn't show his reaction, but something inside settled into a deeper frown. "Thank you," he said softly. "If you think of anything else—" Patel nodded. "Of course." Hamish stepped back outside, the cold air closing around him again. Lugs shook himself, scattering droplets. Hamish touched the dog's head lightly. "Something's wrong," he murmured. By midday, Hamish returned to Torrens Croft once more. He used the landline inside to ring Strathbane, though the line crackled so badly he had to repeat himself. When Blair arrived an hour later, stomping from his car as though the ground offended him, Hamish braced himself. "What nonsense is this now?" Blair snapped. "A crofter goes missing, and you expect us to believe it's foul play." "I said nothing of the sort," Hamish replied mildly. Blair barged inside the croft, boots thudding on the floor. "Bah! He's probably fallen in the loch. You villagers panic at the least wee thing." Hamish watched Blair tromp over the faint marks by the threshold. Lugs let out a soft growl. "You'll ruin the tracks," Hamish said softly. "There's nothing here," Blair barked. "You should have cleaned this place up before calling us." Hamish bit down on a dry remark. Instead, he feigned concern. "Blair, you're right. Maybe we should gather volunteers before word spreads. Folk panic easily." Blair puffed with self-importance. "Aye, fine idea. I'll head back to Strathbane and organise it properly." Hamish nodded, grateful to see the sergeant turn away. Once Blair was far enough, Hamish crouched again near the disturbed reeds. Luggs sniffed the ground urgently, letting out a small whine toward the loch. Hamish followed the direction of the dog's gaze, but nothing surfaced on the still water. By late afternoon, villagers had begun forming small clusters along the path, whispering to one another. The Curry sisters argued over whether Torrin had simply taken ill somewhere. "He's an old man," Jessie insisted. "These things happen." "Aye, but not like this," Nessie muttered. Hamish felt the weight of their eyes as he scanned the shoreline one final time. The fog began to rise again, cloaking the hills in pale grey. "Right," Hamish said at last. "We'll call off the search for today. There's no sense in anyone catching cold." He waited as the villagers dispersed reluctantly. By the time Hamish reached his cottage, drizzle clung to the windows like a thin veil. Inside, he lit the peat fire, watching the flames take hold slowly. The warmth seeped into the room, though it did little to chase the loneliness creeping in at the edges. Why had Torrin stayed awake to watch Hamish's cottage? And who had visited him? Hamish sat in his worn armchair, lugs curling close against his legs, head resting heavily as if to keep him grounded. Outside, the drizzle whispered against the glass, steady and patient. Hamish stared into the fire, thinking not of fear, but of unanswered questions settling over Loch Dubh like the mist itself, quiet, persistent, and full of things not yet seen. Dawn had not so much arrived as crept in reluctantly, dragging a smear of pale grey behind it. The wind carried the early promise of a storm, whipping through the heather in restless shivers. Hamish Macbeth walked the loch path with lugs pressed close to his leg, the dog's coat ruffled by the sharp gusts. The cold air stung Hamish's cheeks, and he pulled his old jacket tighter around him. The night's unease had never fully left him. He had lain awake longer than was useful, listening to the breathing of the village settle into its slow morning rhythm. Mist clung to the loch like a thin veil, leaving the surface looking still and secretive. Hamish's boots made damp impressions in the mud as he walked, careful and deliberate. Lug suddenly tugged toward a narrow ledge that jutted out over the water, whining softly. Hamish followed the dog's pull, stepping onto the slick stones. From the corner of his eye he noticed something half submerged, a dull, rounded shape lodged between two rocks. He crouched and lifted it free. A lantern, waterlogged and dripping, but the metal frame still intact. The glass pane had cracked only slightly, and the wick inside was unburned. Hamish turned it over in his hands. If Torrin had fallen into the loch carrying it, the lantern should have shattered against the stones. Instead it looked placed, not dropped. "Aye," Hamish murmured, "this is no accident." He set the lantern gently on the ground. Lug sniffed at it, then looked up at Hamish with anxious eyes. The wind howled through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of peat smoke from distant crofts. Hamish rose and continued along the loch road toward the jetty. The boards creaked under his boots, wet from the spray. A handful of fishers stood near their boats, a knot of weathered faces turned toward him. "Morning, Constable," called Rory Sinclair, though his tone lacked the cheer such greetings usually carried. "Morning," Hamish replied. "You've heard about Torrin." "Aye," Rory muttered. "Terrible business." Hamish let the silence settle before asking, "Did any of you see him out last night, or the night before?" The men exchanged looks, uneasy. Fisherfolk were direct by nature, but even they preferred gossip to confession. "I saw him walk in the path Thursday night," one said, lantern in hand. "No, you didn't," another cut in sharply. "Torrin wouldn't have walked that path in the dark. Everyone knows he hated being out after sundown." The first man bristled. "I ken what I saw." Hamish observed them quietly, noting more than the words, the twitch of a jaw, the way eyes slid away. Contradictions born of pride or shame, he thought, or simply the Highland tendency to embroider truth until it resembled whatever suited the teller best. "Did Torrin talk to any of you?" Hamish asked gently. "Anything at all?" "He asked about some tourists arrived at the hotel," Rory said at last. "Asked who they were, where they were from. Whispered, like he thought they'd hear him across the room." Hamish nodded slowly. Torrin had been watching his cottage, staying awake to keep an eye on something. Now he'd been asking after strangers. "What did you tell him?" Hamish asked. "Nothing," Rory said. "We didn't know much. They just came for the scenery, or so the hotel owner said." Hamish thanked them and moved on, Lugs walking alertly beside him. The wind drove small stinging pinpricks of rain against his face, and he quickened his pace toward the village. The cottages looked blurred by the worsening weather, their chimneys trailing thin threads of smoke into the thickening sky. Inside the police station, the air held the faint scent of last night's tea and Lugs's damp fur. Hamish removed his jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. Torrin's small bundle of belongings sat neatly on his desk, collected from the croft with quiet care. Hamish untied the string and sifted through them. An old wallet, a creased handkerchief, a tin of mints, and a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the lot. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, cramped as if written by someone who feared being interrupted. "If the light returns, do not go alone." Hamish stared at the words. Lugs whined softly, as if sensing the gravity of the message. Hamish folded the note and returned it to the desk, his mind sorting through possibilities. Torrin had been frightened, not confused. Something real had pushed him to write that warning. The door burst open without warning. "What have ye hidden from us now?" came Blair's bark. Hamish winced inwardly before turning. Detective Sergeant Blair stood dripping on the threshold, his cheap coat soaked through. Anderson hovered behind him, nodding uselessly like a decorative ornament. "I haven't hidden anything," Hamish said mildly, "though you're welcome to look." Blair stomped across the room, knocking Lugs' water bowl and splashing its contents across the floor. Lugs growled, the sound low and dangerous. Blair ignored it, snatching up Torrin's belongings and rifling through them. "What's this?" he demanded, holding the note like a scrap of rubbish. "A message Torrin left," Hamish answered with calm patience. "Means nothing," Blair sneered. "Old fool probably wrote it after too much whiskey. You Highlanders can be pathetic." Hamish swallowed the instinct to respond. Instead he shrugged, feigning indifference. "Aye, maybe you're right, but the villagers will want reassurance." Blair puffed proudly. "That's why I'm here, to handle things properly, unlike you." Fortunately, the station phone rang. Hamish answered, but could hear Daviot's nervous tone even before the crackling line stabilised. "Macbeth, I'm hearing reports of a missing crofter. This can't become a scandal. The press are sniffing about after that tourist incident." "We're handling it, sir," Hamish replied, keeping his voice flat. "You'd better," Daviot said sharply. "No mistakes." The line died in a burst of static. Blair snorted. "See? HQ knows you're out of your depth." Hamish rubbed the back of his neck. "You're right. Perhaps it's best you head back to Strathbane, Sergeant. I'll call once I've sorted the villagers. They trust me more. Saves you dealing with their fuss." Blair, flattered by the implied concession, puffed up further. "Aye, I suppose so." He jabbed a finger at Hamish. "Don't muck it up." Then he left, Anderson trailing behind him like a shadow. Hamish exhaled quietly. Lugs huffed, ears flattening slightly. "Aye, boy," Hamish murmured. "I know." Evening descended early with the storm closing in. The wind rattled the station windows and the loch churned darkly beyond the village. Hamish sat by the window with Lugs pressed against his leg. A kettle hissed on the stove. The station felt smaller tonight, the walls holding the scent of peat smoke and damp wool. Around midnight, Lugs stiffened. His head shot up, ears high and alert. Hamish followed the dog's gaze toward the darkened cottage beyond the station. A faint glow flickered in his bedroom window. Hamish froze. The light swayed gently, warm, soft, unmistakably lantern-like, casting a brief arc across the inside wall. Hamish rose slowly, heart beating with quiet dread, and stepped outside. The cold air hit him sharply, and the wind whipped his hair across his forehead. Lug stayed close, tail low, body tense. As Hamish approached the cottage, the glow pulsed once more, then vanished. Not dimmed, not moved. Gone. Hamish stood in the cold, staring at the dark window, feeling the hair rise on the back of his neck. Lugs pressed against his leg, Shivering not from the cold, but from something deeper, Hamish whispered, "We're not imagining it." The storm growled overhead, and the first heavy drop of rain splashed onto his cheek. He turned back toward the station, feeling the weight of questions settling more heavily than the storm clouds. Torrin had seen something real, and now Hamish had too. Morning drizzle clung to Loch-Dubh like a half-hearted apology from the weather, soft enough not to bother anyone determined, but persistent enough to dampen every sleeve and fray every nerve. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the road toward the village square, lugs padding at his side with a seriousness unusual even for him. The night's strange lantern light still hovered in Hamish's mind like a whisper he couldn't quite shake. The loch air smelled of wet earth and distant peat smoke, and the sky hung low, pressing down as though listening in. He wasn't one for rushing, especially when his thoughts needed sorting. Torrin's disappearance had left the village uneasy, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. People walked more quickly than usual, glancing at one another with forced cheer. Loch-Dubh did not like trouble, and when it arrived the villagers preferred to blame anything else first. Hamish stopped outside Patel's shop. The door opened just long enough for Patel to lean out, eyebrows raised. "You're starting early today, Constable." "Needs must," Hamish murmured. "Folks saw Torrin with different faces last week. I'd like to speak with them." Patel nodded meaningfully. "You'll find Moira McLean at her cottage. She's been asking about the inheritance already, though she pretends otherwise." Hamish thanked him and moved on. Lugs gave a short huff, shaking droplets from his fur. The path to Moira's cottage wound past low stone fences slick with moss. She stood at her door when Hamish approached, pale hair scraped into a bun too tight for comfort. Her mouth pinched into a line when she saw him. "Hamish Macbeth," she said, voice clipped. "I suppose you've come about Uncle Torrin." Hamish kept his tone light. "Aye. Just wanting to know if he said anything to you recently." Moira crossed her arms. Only that he was tired of folk pestering him. He'd been losing his senses for months, wandering the paths at all hours, talking nonsense about lights and shadows. Her eyes darted away too quickly. Hamish saw the defensive pride behind her impatience. Villagers had long memories, and Moira's years-long estrangement from Torrin was no secret. She didn't want blame sticking to her. "Did he come here?" Hamish asked softly. "No," she snapped. "And if he had, I'd have sent him home. He was always meddling." At her feet, Lugs let out a single soft bark. Moira flinched, then glared at the dog. Hamish thanked her politely and stepped away before her discomfort turned to hostility. As he walked back toward the main road, he felt Lugs press close, the dog sensing a tension Moira had tried too hard to hide. Gregor Watt's croft wasn't far from Moira's. Hamish reached it just as Gregor stumbled out carrying a bucket, scowling at the sky as if the drizzle had personally insulted him. He was a broad man with a permanent grimace etched into his cheeks, and his voice carried the blunt tone of someone who'd never learned to soften his opinions. "Hamish," Gregor grunted. "If this is about Torrin, I'll say it plain. He was a nuisance." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "A nuisance how?" Gregor slammed the bucket down. "Boundary fence, that's how. Man couldn't keep his beasts on his own side. Came wandering over every other day, complaining about my sheep as if he owned the land. We argued, but I didn't lay a finger on him." Hamish let silence settle, then said quietly, "Did you see him the night he disappeared?" Gregor hesitated only a fraction. "Didn't see him at all?" "A beat. Wasn't looking for him either." Lug stood rigid at Hamish's heel. A low growl vibrated in the dog's throat, startling even Gregor. Hamish placed a calming hand on the dog's head. "Easy, boy." Gregor's eyes narrowed. "That animal of yours has always had it in for me." "Lugs has fine judgment," Hamish said mildly. "Thank you for your time." The road toward the hotel curved near the loch, and rainfall pattered gently against the water, forming brief expanding rings. Hamish found Mrs. Duff standing outside her hotel with a broom in hand, brushing at the front step, though it was far too wet for sweeping. "Constable Macbeth," she said briskly, tightening her cardigan. "I suppose you're sniffing around like everyone else." Hamish smiled faintly. "I'm only looking for the truth. Torrin might have spoken to you." Mrs. Duff sniffed. "He was bothering my guests last week, asking who they were, where they'd been before Loch-Dubh. It unsettled them. We run a respectable establishment. We don't need crofters frightening folk." "What did the guests say?" Hamish asked. "That he was acting strangely. whispering as if someone were after him. I told him to stop bothering them. He left without a word. She hesitated, lowering her broom. He wasn't himself, Hamish, but I'm not saying he was mad. Hamish gave her a gentle nod. Mrs. Duff never admitted uncertainty unless she feared her reputation might suffer. Luggs sniffed at the hotel door, then walked back to Hamish, tail stiff. That was clue enough. Torrin had indeed come here, and something about the encounter troubled the dog even now. The tourist couple, young and stiff-backed, sat in the hotel lounge with teacups poised just so. Their accents were clipped, and their smiles too tight to be genuine. Hamish greeted them politely. "You were staying here when Torrin came by," he said. "Did he speak to you?" The man adjusted his glasses nervously. He asked peculiar questions about whether we'd walk the lock path at night, whether we'd seen a light in your window. Made us uneasy, to be honest. "He meant no harm," Hamish said gently. "Did he look frightened?" The woman exchanged a glance with her husband. "He looked determined," she said finally, "and tired." Outside, Hamish paused under the hotel awning. The storm clouds that had gathered earlier now pressed low and heavy, the air thick with the smell of damp stone. He walked toward the kirk, where Minister McPhee was locking the door after some early meeting. "Morning, Hamish," the minister said. His voice held its usual warmth, but his eyes looked wary. "I'm asking after Torrin," Hamish said. "I've heard he spoke to you." Minister McPhee stiffened. "He came for spiritual guidance. I cannot discuss it." "I'm not asking for confessions," Hamish said gently, "only if he seemed afraid." McPhee's gaze flickered. He was troubled, spoke of seeing something he wasn't sure he should mention, but he left before explaining. I urged him to rest. Hamish nodded, though the answer left him unsatisfied. McPhee was hiding something, out of loyalty or shame, Hamish couldn't yet tell. By the time he returned to the village square, gossip had already rippled through every doorway. The Curry sisters stood outside the post office, arguing with the fervour of hens startled by fox tracks. "He was seeing things," Jessie insisted. "Lantern lights where none were. Shadows in windows. Poor soul must have been half blind." "Blind nothing," Nessie snapped. "Folk don't imagine the same thing twice. Something's amiss, Jessie." Hamish approached, and both women straightened immediately. "Constable," Jessie said sweetly, "we were just saying Torrin was not himself lately." "Aye," Nessie added sharply, "but that doesn't mean he made everything up." Hamish let them talk, absorbing each contradiction. In Lockdube, truth always hid behind what people refused to say. As he left them, Luggs rubbed against his leg, unsettled. Hamish looked down at him. "You're picking up more than I am, boy." Walking back toward the station, Hamish let the drizzle soak through his hair. He didn't bother writing anything down. Notes made folk nervous. Better to let intuition do its work. Every conversation he'd had felt shaped by half-truths. Each villager clung to something: defensiveness, embarrassment, suspicion, or pride. A red herring formed as naturally as mist on the loch. Torrin had been superstitious, frightened by shadows, inventing lights that never existed. But Hamish didn't believe it. Superstitious men didn't write warnings. They certainly didn't vanish in silence. When he reached the station, Luggs sat heavily by the door, ears flicking in the drizzle. Hamish lingered on the threshold a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Torrin had been looking for something, or for someone, and Hamish suspected the village, so full of secrets it barely remembered which belonged to whom, knew exactly more than it wanted to say. He stepped inside, the warmth of the peat fire touching his face, but not reaching the unease clenched quietly in his chest. This was only the beginning. Low fog wrapped itself around Lockdube, as if the village were a fragile thing needing shelter from the world. The mist drifted through every gap between the cottages, softening edges and muffling sound. Hamish Macbeth walked toward Torrin McLean's croft with Luggs at his heel, the dog's head low, ears twitching at each faint noise. The morning held a strange quiet, the kind that made Hamish feel the weight of the empty places Torrin used to stand. A weak smell of peat smoke lingered in the air, though nothing burned now inside the croft. Hamish pushed open the door, letting damp air slip past him. The hearth still held the shape of the last peat bricks Torrin had laid, though they were cold as stone. Hamish knelt and poked the fire to life, coaxing smoke up the narrow chimney until a thin line rose into the thick fog outside. Luggs circled once, uneasy, then lay near the hearth with his head resting on his paws. Hamish rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the heat spread through his fingers. He had searched the croft twice already, but something tugged at him, as though Torrin had left more than the broken lamp and scattered belongings. After a long moment, Hamish knelt on the floorboards again, letting instinct choose a spot. His fingers traced the lines of the wood, pausing at a loose board near the wall. With a quiet grunt, he pried it up. Dust puffed out. Beneath lay a small tin box, the lid rusted at the edges. Hamish lifted it carefully, the metal cold against his palms. Luggs raised his head, watching. Inside the box lay a collection of receipts, a few notes written in Torrin's shaky hand, and a crude map drawn on a scrap of paper. The map marked only a short stretch of the loch's edge, but the X scratched across it lay directly opposite Hamish's own cottage. Hamish stared at the mark, a faint prickle running at the nape of his neck. Torrin had been watching that place for a reason. Footsteps sounded outside. Luggs gave a sharp huff. Minister McPhee appeared in the doorway, his coat darkened by fog, his expression drawn. "Hamish," he said softly, "I saw your boots by the path. Thought you might be here." Hamish rose, slipping the tin box into his jacket. I'm still looking through Torrin's things." McPhee stepped inside, removing his hat. He looked around the croft with a troubled gaze. "He came to me not long ago," the minister said. "Said he'd seen something he wasn't sure was proper to mention. Asked for counsel." Hamish waited, sensing the man's discomfort. "But he wouldn't speak plainly," McPhee continued, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "I urged him to rest, to pray on it, but he left no clearer than he arrived." "He was frightened," Hamish said gently. McPhee swallowed. "Yes, and I fear I failed him." His eyes flicked to the hearth, the gentle rise of the new flame. "If you find what burdened him, Hamish, I hope it brings peace." Hamish nodded, though he knew peace was seldom what came first. When McPhee left, the fog swallowed him quickly, as if keeping the man's guilt tucked away from light. Later, Hamish and Luggs walked toward Patel's shop. The damp stone of the street shone like polished slate, and hens pecking near the fence scattered at Luggs' approach. Inside the shop, warmth and the faint smell of spices greeted him. Patel arranged tins with neat precision, his moustache twitching when he saw Hamish enter. "Constable," Patel said, "you look as if the fog followed you inside." Hamish offered a weary smile. "I'm trying to understand what Torrin was about in his last days." Patel hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He said something odd to me last week, complained that folk in Lochdoub pretend old men are foolish because it suits their comfort, said secrets were kept that way." Hamish felt a shift inside himself, a small click of understanding. "What did you say to him?" "That I sold tea, not truth." Patel sighed, but he only nodded, as if expecting no better. Hamish thanked him quietly and stepped back into the cool air. Luggs walked close, tail low, sensing Hamish's growing tension. The map weighed against Hamish's chest like a second heart. He crossed the village toward the loch path, the fog parting around him in thin sheets. Sheep bleated somewhere in the distance. A crow perched on a fence post tilted its head, watching. The marked place on Torrin's map lay on a narrow shore where the loch bent inward, forming a shallow curve. Hamish's boots squelched in the damp grass. Luggs ran ahead, nose down, sniffing eagerly. The fog thinned here, revealing a patch of disturbed soil. Hamish crouched, brushing his fingers over it. The earth had been dug recently, perhaps within the last day or two. A small hole remained, its shape suggesting something box-sized had been taken. Luggs pawed at the hollow with soft whines, then looked back at Hamish with troubled eyes. "What did they hide here, boy?" Hamish murmured. "And what did Torrin see?" The wind carried a smell of impending rain, sharp and metallic. Hamish straightened, scanning the loch. The water lay still beneath the fog, as though listening. A faint ripple broke the surface, then vanished. He felt watched, not by menace, but by the weight of something left unresolved. He turned back toward the village, rain beginning in thin, uncertain drops. The sky deepened to a darker grey. Luggs walked close to his leg, nudging him occasionally as though urging caution. Hamish felt that caution himself. Torrin had witnessed something, a meeting perhaps, or someone bearing something not meant to be found. The old man's fear had not been foolishness. It had been understanding, too late to save him. By the time Hamish reached the station, the drizzle had thickened. He stepped inside, shook off his jacket, and rubbed warmth back into his hands. Luggs settled heavily near the hearth. Hamish lit a small fire, watching the peat catch with a reluctant spark. The croft, the map, the disturbed soil, each piece nudged his thoughts in similar directions. Someone in Loch had done something worth hiding, and Torrin, stubborn old soul that he was, had seen it. Hamish sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. The flames flickered softly against the stone. His thoughts moved with the patient rhythm he'd learned from years of village life. There would be gossip, there would be lies, both deliberate and protective. But beneath them would lie the truth. Small, human, and seldom dramatic, but powerful enough to ruin a man if kept hidden too long. Lugs shifted, letting out a small sigh. Hamish reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. "I'll find it, boy," he whispered. "Whatever it was, I'll find it." Outside, the rain grew steadier, tapping against the window like quiet footsteps seeking entry. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the loch path until nothing remained but grey. Somewhere within that grey, Torrin's last sight waited for Hamish to uncover. The morning arrived without colour, as though the sky had forgotten how to wake. A thick, cold greyness smothered the hills, sliding down into the village until even the loch seemed to shrink beneath it. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside the station and felt the chill settle instantly into his bones. The air held the raw dampness of an unfinished night, and visibility stretched only a few yards ahead. Lugs walked close at his side, the dog's breath forming small, anxious clouds in the cold. The village was hushed, the kind of hush that felt too deliberate. Somewhere far off, a gull cried, dull and tired. Hamish put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the path that bent toward the loch. He had hoped for clarity today, though he wasn't sure what form that would take. Torrin's absence pressed around him heavier than the fog. They had barely reached the bend when a shout sliced through the mist. "Hamish! Hamish Macbeth! Over here!" The fisher's voice carried oddly, muffled at the edges but sharp in the centre. Hamish felt lugs stiffen. Together they broke into a jog, the earth soft beneath their boots. The fog parted reluctantly near the loch's curve. A small group of fishers stood clustered at the shoreline, their faces pale and drawn as they stared at something floating near the reed bed. Hamish slowed, then approached the water with the kind of dread he'd learned to recognise but never grew used to. Torrin's body drifted gently against the reeds, the loch giving him a strange tenderness. The crofter looked almost peaceful, his limbs arranged with unnatural care, as though someone had placed him there rather than the water claiming him honestly. His hair fanned softly in the current, and his cap was missing. One of the fishers cleared his throat. "We saw him from the boats. Thought it was a sack at first." Hamish nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He crouched beside the water, his breath escaping in a slow exhale. There was a quiet ache under his ribs. Not shock, not fear, but the muted sorrow that came when a lonely man left the world with no one to mark the hour. Lug sat beside him, ears pressed flat, a soft whine humming in his throat. Hamish reached forward and steadied Torrin's shoulder with careful fingers, guiding the body toward the bank. Together, with two of the fishers, they lifted the crofter onto the damp grass. Water dripped from his coat in steady threads. Hamish noticed immediately that Torrin's boots were spotless inside, his socks dry. His clothes, though wet on the outside, held a tidiness that contradicted any notion of panic or stumbling. "He didn't struggle," Hamish murmured. "What was that?" asked Rory Sinclair. "Nothing yet," Hamish said, rising to his feet as he adjusted his jacket. His voice remained soft, but his mind ticked through details. Torrin carried small items always, his tin of mints, a folded handkerchief, sometimes a scrap of note. Yet his pockets were empty. Too empty. Before Hamish could say more, the sound of grinding tyres and a door slamming broke through the mist. Detective Sergeant Blair appeared like a sour apparition, his coat flapping as he stormed toward the group. Anderson followed a step behind, his expression the same nervous eagerness he always wore in Blair's presence. "Well, well," Blair barked. "There he is. Knew it would turn out to be nothing but a daft accident. You Highlands lot always make a fuss." Hamish held back a sigh. "Morning, Sergeant." Blair glared down at Torrin's body. "He fell in. End of story." Hamish kept his tone mild. If he fell, he did so very neatly. Blair frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Hamish knelt again, lifting the hem of Torrin's coat. "Boots are dry, inside and out, and his pockets are empty." "Maybe he emptied them himself," Blair snapped. No man leaves his mints behind, Hamish replied gently, not looking up. Not Torrin. Blair's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing someone of something? I'm saying it looks arranged, Hamish said softly. Placed. Blair puffed like a kettle. You're making trouble where none exists. Hamish straightened, rubbing the back of his neck with a feigned uncertainty he didn't feel. Maybe you're right, Sergeant. I'm probably overthinking. He paused just long enough for Blair to relax. You'd better take charge then. Folk trust you know how to handle these matters. Blair preened instantly, the prospect of authority smoothing his irritation. Aye, well, I'll do that. While Blair stomped around giving nonsensical orders, Hamish stepped back with Lugs. The dog pressed against his leg, sensing the rising unease spreading among the villagers. More people had gathered now, Mrs. Barclay clutching her shawl, the Curry sisters whispering loudly enough to be heard across the path, Gregor Watt standing stiff as a fence post with guilt flickering in his eyes. Hamish observed each face, the shifting glances, the stiff posture, the subtle shame. Villagers hid things better than they admitted, but truth tended to cling to their expressions like stubborn fog. What a pity, Jessie Curry said, shaking her head with a touch of theatrical sadness. Aye, Nessie replied, though her stare never left Gregor. Some folk disagreed with him more than they should. Gregor bristled. Don't start your nonsense, Nessie. It's not nonsense, she snapped. Folk heard your arguing. Hamish stepped between them with a calm gesture. Let's keep our thoughts steady. Torrin deserves quiet, not quarrels. The sisters fell silent, but their eyes kept sparking with speculation. Rain began to fall just then, a sharp, cold burst that signalled the storm breaking overhead. Droplets pattered on the loch, rippling across its surface. Blair cursed the weather, fumbling with his coat. Villagers pulled scarves around their necks or hurried beneath makeshift shelter. Within moments the crowd thinned, people scattering like leaves caught in a sudden wind. Hamish remained, the rain plastering his red hair to his forehead. He crouched again beside Torrin's still form, the drizzle glossing the man's features. Lugs pressed against him, trembling faintly. His heart gave out, said one of the fishers softly. Cold shock, maybe. Hamish nodded but didn't agree. Torrin's fear had been too precise, too recent, and the empty pockets, the tidy clothes, signs of hands other than his own. When the fisher walked away, Hamish leaned closer to Lugs. The rain drummed harder, running down his collar. He whispered, I'll find it, old boy. His voice barely carried above the storm. Whatever they're hiding, we'll find it. Lugs whimpered, then nudged his hand gently. Hamish stood slowly, wiping rain from his eyes. Blair had retreated to the shelter of his car, ranting loudly to Anderson about incompetent villagers and that fool Macbeth making trouble again. Hamish let the rant wash over him like so much background noise. Mist curled around the loch in thicker swirls now, rising with the storm's push. The reeds trembled, bending under the weight of wind. Sheep bleated in the distance, calling weakly against the growing gale. Hamish took one final look at Torrin. There was a gentleness to the old man, always had been, that lingered even now in the way his hands rested lightly against his sides. Someone had arranged him to look at peace, someone who didn't want suspicion. As Hamish walked back toward the village, his boots sinking into the soaked ground, he felt the kind of quiet resolve that often guided his work more reliably than any order from Strathbane. The villagers' guilt, the missing belongings, the stage stillness, each piece sat heavily in his thoughts. The storm intensified, rain lashing the path in relentless sheets. Hamish didn't hurry. Lug stayed close, ears back, tail low, glancing frequently toward the dark water. Lightning flickered faintly behind the clouds, followed by a long, rolling rumble. Hamish kept walking, the weight of the case settling into his bones the way the cold settled into the loch. He didn't feel fear. He felt responsibility. By the time he reached the station, rainwater streamed down his sleeves, and Lugs shook himself violently at the doorway, spraying droplets across the floor. Hamish stepped inside, closing the door against the storm's howl. The station felt too warm after the loch's chill. The peat fire snapped faintly in the grate, a thin thread of orange light flickering across the walls. Hamish stood there, dripping, staring at the flames. Torrin had seen something. Torrin had feared something. And Hamish, standing alone with Lugs pressed to his leg, knew now with certainty that the crofter's death was no accident. It was a warning, and whatever had caused it had not finished casting shadows across Loch Dubh. Storm winds battered Loch from the west, driving sheets of cold rain sideways across the loch and rattling the shutters of cottages that had weathered far worse over the years. Hamish Macbeth stood at his window, watching the water churn under the grey morning sky. The world had narrowed to rain, wind, and the restless movement of mist swirling across the surface. Lug sat beside him, ears flattened, tail thudding once against the floor in muted irritation. Hamish rubbed his tired eyes. He had slept little. The memory of the lantern glow flickering in his window, vanishing the instant he approached, had kept him turning in his damp sheets for hours. He tried again to sort the possibilities. Tourists with odd habits. Some local lad looking for mischief, a thief testing whether the cottage was empty, even Blair attempting some petty intimidation. Each explanation rose and fell with equal weakness. None felt true. In the end, Hamish trusted the same thing he always trusted, the small tug in his chest that told him when a lie was hiding inside a truth. The wind howled against the stone walls as he and Lug stepped outside. Rain slapped at their faces. They made their way down the slick path toward the hotel, boots sinking slightly into puddles that had formed overnight. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys, the scent of peat mixing with damp heather. Even in rough weather, Loch smelled like home. Inside the hotel lounge, the tourist couple sat at a small round table with their luggage piled beside them. The woman wore a crisp blouse despite the weather, and the man had polished his glasses so many times they gleamed unnaturally. Their suitcase rattled faintly when the floorboards creaked, though neither seemed to notice it. Hamish nodded politely. "Sorry to trouble you again. I've more questions about Torrin." The man shifted in his seat with a stiff politeness. "Of course, Constable. We've already said what we know." "He believed you'd been walking past my cottage at night," Hamish said, voice gentle. "Were you?" "No," the woman replied quickly. "We were inside. We don't go wandering in storms." Hamish's gaze drifted to the rattling suitcase. "You leaving early?" The man gave a brittle laugh. "We just thought the weather is rather more dramatic than expected." "Aye," Hamish murmured. "The Highlands can be that." He let his eyes linger on the suitcase a second longer before stepping back. "Safe travels. If Torrin did mistake you, it's not your doing." They nodded with relief, though their expressions tightened as soon as he turned away. Lug sniffed the air and huffed, then gave the suitcase a single sharp glance before walking out with Hamish. The storm had worsened, and Hamish tugged his jacket tighter as he crossed the square. The drizzle hit sideways now, and smoke from nearby chimneys streamed horizontal in the wind. As he approached Patel's shop, a pair of villagers rushed past, whispering to each other with that sharp, excited tone that meant trouble had found a new host. "Moira's at it again," one muttered, bold as brass. "Aye, rushing the inheritance before the body's even cold," the other whispered. Hamish sighed. The village never missed a chance to turn grief into theatre. He found Moira McLean standing outside the shop, clutching a folder to her chest like it contained gold. Her face, pale and severe, tightened when she saw him. "Hamish," she said cautiously. "You've been busy," Hamish replied. Lug stood at his side, tail unmoving, eyes fixed on her. "I'm only dealing with what needs dealt with," she said defensively. "Uncle Torrin would have wanted things in order." "Aye," Hamish said quietly, "but most folk wait a bit longer before asking after paperwork." Moira flushed, though the anger came quicker than the shame. "Folk talk because they've nothing else to do. I just want to know what I'm due." Hamish studied her face a moment. Sharp lines, tired eyes, something restless behind them. Too restless to carry out something as neat as staging a man's death. Too transparent for deceit without cracking. He nodded. "I understand, but rushing it will only stir more gossip." She looked away, shoulders stiffening. "Let them gossip, they always do." Lugs let out a soft, suspicious grunt. Hamish touched the dog's head lightly. "Thanks for your time, Moira." She didn't answer. The rain had become a heavy curtain by the time Hamish reached Gregor Watt's croft. Gregor stood under the eave, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "You again?" he said, unimpressed. Hamish kept his tone mild. "I need to ask about the night Torrin vanished." "I told you," Gregor muttered. "Didn't see him." "But you heard something," Hamish said. "What was it?" Gregor hesitated. A flash, guilt, annoyance passed through his eyes. "Maybe I heard footsteps outside. Maybe. But I didn't look. I'm not Torrin's keeper." You didn't think to check? Gregor bristled. Folk walk about at night. Doesn't mean anything. Hamish nodded slowly. Maybe so. But the man's words carried the same brittle edge that hid more than they revealed. Lugs gave a sudden short bark. Sharp. Singular. Hamish didn't miss the way Gregor flinched. Good day, Hamish said quietly. Gregor grunted and stepped back inside. The wind shoved Hamish sideways as he and Lugs made their way home, the rain lashing their coats. By the time he reached his cottage, twilight had blurred the sky into a deeper, colder grey. He lit a small lamp and hung his jacket by the fire. Lugs lay near the hearth but didn't relax. His ears remained half-raised, flicking at every whistle of wind through the eaves. Hamish made tea, watching steam curl up from the chipped kettle. His mind drifted again to the lantern light. Once when he was away, once when he was inside. Someone wanted him to see it. Someone wanted Torrin to see something as well. By late evening, the storm's fury steadied into a relentless rhythm. Hamish sat in his armchair, feet stretched toward the fire. The window glass shuddered with each heavy gust. Lugs lay on the rug, but suddenly shot upright, growling deep in his chest. Hamish's heart tugged. He stood quickly and crossed to the window. The glow appeared again, a warm, flickering light dancing behind the curtain of his own bedroom window. Hamish froze. He was inside the cottage this time. There was no lantern lit, no lamp burning. Lugs barked sharply, racing to the door. Hamish grabbed his coat and stepped outside into the storm. Rain pelted him, cold enough to sting. He moved quickly across the mud, boots slipping. Lugs ran ahead, barking furiously at the hills. Hamish turned back toward his cottage. No light. The window sat dark and still. Lightning split the sky for a brief second, revealing the hillside path. Something metallic flashed, a faint glint, instantly swallowed by darkness. A mirror, or a polished lantern. Something reflective catching the briefest flicker of lightning or torchlight. Hamish's breath came out in a long, steadying stream. Someone wasn't inside his cottage. Someone was outside it. Someone on the loch path was creating the illusion. Lugs growled again, staring into the dark. Hamish put a hand on the dog's back, grounding him, and grounding himself. The storm raged, but the truth lay suddenly clear. It had never been a haunting. It had been a signal, or a warning, or a distraction. Someone wanted Torrin, and now Hamish, to look at the wrong place. Hamish stood in the rain, hair plastered to his forehead, and whispered, "We're closer now, boy. Much closer." The storm roared back in answer, the loch churning as though stirring some deeper secret beneath its surface. The night pressed down over Loch Dubh in a heavy, breath-held silence, the kind that made even the sheep on the distant hills shift uneasily. A thin mist crawled along the moor, curling around clumps of heather and drifting across the narrow path like pale, restless fingers. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly, his boots making soft, damp impressions in the earth. Lug stayed close to his leg, the dog's posture tense, ears flicking at every faint rustle. The cold air tasted of peat smoke carried from distant crofts, mingled with the sharper scent of rain waiting to fall. Loch Dubh's scattered lights glimmered behind them, blurred halos through the mist. The further Hamish walked, the more the village seemed to shrink into a quiet cluster of warmth far behind him. Out here the moors kept their own counsel. He carried no torch. Light attracted attention, and tonight he wanted to see what moved in the dark when it thought no one was watching. The memory of the reflected glow in his window had tugged him outside again, this time not hastily but with purpose. Torrin had been lured out by that same light. Hamish meant to let himself be lured too. The wind shifted, brushing his cheek with a chill. Lug stopped suddenly, staring ahead into the murk. A low growl rumbled in his chest, quiet, but unmistakably certain. Hamish placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension vibrating beneath the fur. "Aye, boy," he murmured softly. "I see it." Something had moved. Not much, not boldly, but enough. A darker shadow within the dark, slipping behind a boulder near the curve that overlooked the loch. Hamish slowed, letting his breath calm. Panic spooked people into foolishness. Calm made them reveal themselves. He took a few quiet steps forward. Lugs pressed so close he nearly brushed Hamish's knee. The moor felt alive around them. The heather rustled faintly, stirred by more than wind. A pebble shifted under Hamish's boot and skittered down the gentle slope, bouncing once, then settling. Another rock answered, not thrown, dislodged, a clumsy foot scrambling backward in haste. Hamish stilled completely. "Easy," he said into the night, voice low, steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Silence followed, deep and shivering. Lugs growled again, louder this time. Hamish stepped forward slowly, hands visible, palms relaxed. "If you've something to say, you can say it. No one's looking to harm you." The mist swirled, distorting shapes. For a moment, he saw the faint outline of a figure, a shoulder, the edge of a jacket. Then it vanished behind the boulder with a hurried scrape of boots against stone. Whoever it was, they weren't bold enough for confrontation. Fear, not aggression, guided their movements. Hamish reached the boulder, pausing at its edge. Lugg strained forward, nose to the ground, pulling slightly against Hamish's grip on his collar. The dog's tail was stiff, not wagging, a sign of concern rather than excitement. "Hold," Hamish murmured. He stepped around the boulder. Only empty moor waited there. The path dipped sharply just beyond, and he could tell the person had fled down it at speed. A few heather stalks still trembled where they'd been brushed aside. Whoever it had been was light on their feet, but desperate enough to leave marks. Hamish crouched, letting his fingers brush over the disturbed earth. The night swallowed sound, making his movements seem louder than they were. Lugg sniffed near a clump of damp grass and let out a short, questioning whine. "What is it, lad?" Hamish whispered. Luggs nudged something partially hidden beneath the heather. The object was wrapped in a scrap of cloth, dark, soaked through, edges frayed. Hamish lifted it gently. The cloth felt oddly heavy for its size. He unfolded it with care. A polished metal plate lay within, no larger than a book cover, its surface slick with dew. Soot marked one edge, smeared roughly as if someone had rubbed out fingerprints. The underside held tiny scratches, perhaps from being propped on stone or held in trembling hands. Hamish tilted it slightly. Even with no lantern here, the metal caught the faint glow of the distant village lights, reflecting enough to mimic the shimmer he'd seen dancing in his window the night before. "A mirror of sorts," he murmured, "or a poor man's version of one." He imagined someone crouched on the moor, the metal plate angled just right to catch a stray flicker from a lantern further down the path, or even to catch the distant glimmer of some cottager's firelight, enough to cast a moving glow in his window, enough to lure Torrin out in confusion. But why? Hamish wrapped the plate again, tucking it carefully into his coat. The mist thickened around him, and he felt the first cold drops of rain touch his cheek. "We'll find the truth, boy," he said quietly, "but whoever was here is more frightened than dangerous." The thought settled uneasily. Fear made people unpredictable. Hamish stood, brushing dew from his knees. Lugg stayed close, almost pressed to his leg. They began the slow walk back toward the village. Rain tapped lightly at first, then grew steadier, forming a fine curtain that softened the world into shades of soft grey. Hamish pulled up his collar, but the wind worked its way inside easily. Water clung to Luggs's fur in dark streaks. The dog shook himself once, then trotted on with renewed seriousness. As they neared the first cottages, faint lights glowed behind curtains. Hamish noticed a movement. A curtain twitched, then stilled. Someone watching. Then another window flickered with a brief silhouette. More watching. Villagers tracked his return with the quiet intensity of people who pretended not to watch but couldn't help themselves. Long grudges, old fears, small shames. Loch-Dubh carried them all. And tonight, those emotions clung to the windows like frost. Hamish walked on, nodding once at a passing shadow he recognised as Jessie Curry's silhouette before she vanished from view. Within moments, the curtain was drawn tightly shut. The storm grew bolder, the rain coming down in messy sheets now. A gutter clanged somewhere above, rattling violently. The smell of wet stone rose around them. Hamish felt the cold seep into his clothes until every movement made the fabric cling to him. Outside Patel's shop, the door was locked, but the faint glow inside hinted Patel was still sweeping or stacking shelves. Hamish thought briefly of knocking, but decided against it. He didn't want new gossip tonight, not while the questions still roamed the moor like restless spirits. Luggs nudged his leg, looking up at him with a soft, insistent whine. "I'm all right," Hamish said gently. "Just tired." By the time they reached the station, both were soaked through. Hamish opened the door and ushered Luggs inside. The warmth from the small peat fire greeted them at once, releasing a slow sigh from Hamish's chest. Lugs shook violently, sending droplets flying across the floor. Hamish closed the door behind them, locking out the storm. He removed his coat, draping it near the fire. The polished metal plate slid slightly in his pocket, catching his attention again. He placed it on the table. The firelight reflected faintly off its surface, a weak, trembling glow. He imagined Torrens staring at such a light from across the loch, puzzled, then frightened. Imagined him stepping outside, walking toward that glow, searching for something he couldn't name. Hamish's jaw tightened. "Someone wanted to trick him," he said quietly, "and they tried the same with me." Lugs rested his head against Hamish's knee. Hamish scratched him absently behind the ears. "We're close now," he whispered. "Closer than they know." Rain battered the windows in steady rhythm, filling the cottage with the relentless drum of a Highland storm. Outside, the moor sat shrouded in darkness, holding its secrets close. But Hamish could feel the pattern now, the shape of the truth revealing itself piece by piece, like a faint path appearing beneath starlight. He looked once more at the metal plate, the small cloth, and the soot marking one corner. Someone had fled tonight. Someone had panicked. And somewhere in Loch Dubh, that person was now sitting in silence, trembling, wondering whether Hamish Macbeth had recognised them in the dark. "We'll find them, boy," Hamish murmured. "And soon." Lugs breathed a soft, steady breath as if agreeing. The fire crackled, and outside the night kept its watch. Morning broke reluctantly over Loch Dubh, the sky struggling through layers of mist as though it regretted having to wake at all. The air was sharp with cold, the kind that lingered in the lungs. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the station with a mug of lukewarm tea cupped in his hands, watching the fog drift along the loch's surface. It moved slowly, the way tired thoughts did, curling around the jetties and dissolving over the water. Lug sat beside him, tail still, ears twitching at passing sounds hidden by the haze. Hamish had slept little. Torrens' map lay on the table inside, its X marked by the loch now carrying a weight that pressed at the back of his mind. The metal plate he'd found wrapped in cloth rested next to it, still faintly smelling of soot. Someone in Loch Dubh had worked very hard to make Torrens seem confused, and the villagers had worked just as hard to avoid speaking plainly about it. Hamish finished the tea, set the mug on the windowsill and called softly, "Come on, boy." Lugs rose at once. They walked toward Patel's shop, the mist parting before them in soft curls. Patel was sweeping the doorway when Hamish approached. "Morning, constable," he said, though his tone lacked cheer. He glanced behind Hamish as if expecting someone else. "Quiet morning," Hamish said. "As quiet as a village that doesn't want something found," Patel replied, lowering his voice. "People are buying early, but no one lingers. They nod, they whisper, then leave." Hamish studied him. Patel rarely passed along gossip unless he felt uneasy. "You told me Torrens said someone pretended he was foolish." Patel nodded. "And he said something else, that someone was tampering with the land. I thought he meant the fence quarrel with Gregor, but now—" he hesitated. "Now I'm not so sure." Hamish thanked him and walked on. Lugs trotted ahead, nose low, as though the morning itself carried signs only a dog could read. The mist thinned near the crofts. Gregor Watt's fence sat crooked along the boundary, leaning like a drunk toward Torrens' side of the land. Hamish remembered Torrens' quiet outrage about it, the old man's belief that Gregor had no respect for boundaries or neighbours. Gregor was nowhere in sight. His croft looked shut for the morning, smoke drifting lazily from the chimney. Hamish approached the fence, running his hand along the rough wood. The earth beneath it looked disturbed in places, not dramatically, but enough for a trained eye to notice. A patch of soil slightly mounded, grass pressed down unnaturally. Lug sniffed at one section eagerly, tail lifting. "What is it, boy?" Hamish murmured. Lugs pawed once at the mound, then looked up with clear expectation. Hamish knelt, brushing loose soil away with careful fingers. The damp earth gave easily, parting to reveal a dull brown object beneath. Glass. The neck of a bottle. Then another, and another. He exhaled slowly. "Ah," he said under his breath. "So that's what the village didn't want found." He dug further, pulling out a wooden crate hidden just beneath the surface. Inside lay several bottles of whiskey, the expensive kind rarely seen in Loch Dubh except on the shelves of wealthy tourists. Smuggling wasn't uncommon in remote places, but it brought deep shame when discovered. Crofters prided themselves on quiet honesty, mostly. A whiskey smuggling stash hidden on Torran's side of the boundary was exactly the sort of secret that would turn neighbours silent. Hamish replaced the soil loosely, not wanting to disturb the scene further. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Lugg sat nearby, ears forward, watching. Just then a voice snapped from behind him. "What are you doing?" Hamish turned slowly. Gregor Watt stood a few yards away, coat half-buttoned, breathing hard as though he'd hurried back. His eyes darted from the ground to Hamish's face. "Taking a walk," Hamish said mildly. Gregor's jaw clenched. "On my land?" "Torran believed this was his side," Hamish replied, keeping his voice soft. His note said as much. Gregor's face paled a shade. He was daft. Old and daft. "Maybe," Hamish said, "yet he saw someone at this spot. Someone digging." Gregor's breathing grew shallow. "Folk dig. It's land. That's what we do." Hamish crossed his arms lightly, watching Gregor in the gentle, thoughtful way he used when he wanted someone to unravel themselves. "He also saw the light in my window, or what he thought was a light." Gregor swallowed. Hamish continued. "He waited up that night, watched, believed someone was after me, but he wasn't confused. Someone meant him to be confused." Gregor looked away, shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. Lugs growled, low and cautious. Gregor flinched. "He shouldn't have come over," Gregor muttered. "I didn't want trouble." Hamish stepped closer. "Tell me what happened." Gregor rubbed his face with trembling hands. "I had the bottles. I only kept them until I could sell them quietly. Didn't want nosy folk to see. Torran saw me pulling one out. He shouted something about going to you. I panicked." "So you made the light to discredit him," Hamish said. Gregor nodded miserably. "I thought if folk believed he was seeing things, no one would listen when he accused me. I never meant harm." "But harm came anyway," Hamish said gently. Gregor's breath caught. "He followed me that night. He wanted me to face it. I tried to explain, but he grabbed his chest and staggered. I tried to help him, I swear it." Hamish saw the truth in the man's eyes. The shame, the fear, the memory of Torran's sudden collapse. "So you placed him in the loch?" Gregor bowed his head. "I didn't know what to do. Folk would have blamed me. They always do." Hamish felt a long, familiar ache in his chest. Loch Dubh had its kindnesses, but it also carried a harshness born of old grudges and quick judgment. "You should have come to me." Gregor shook his head. "And Blair? He'd have ruined me." Hamish sighed. "Blair ruins many things, but truth finds its way." Gregor's face crumpled. "Torran didn't deserve it. I was only trying to hide a mistake, not kill a man." Rain began again, soft at first, then steadier. The mist thickened, wrapping around them as though trying to shield the scene from the rest of the world. Lugs leaned gently against Hamish's leg. Hamish spoke quietly. "I'll need to tell what happened." Gregor nodded once, accepting it like a man accepting a long-feared winter. "Do what you must." Hamish watched him walk back toward his croft, shoulders heavy. He returned to the station slowly, Lug staying at his heel. Along the way, villagers peeked from windows, expressions pinched. They had known something was wrong. They simply hadn't wanted it uncovered. Not because they liked Gregor, not because they disliked Torran, but because village shame was like a draught. Once it seeped in, it lingered in corners for years. Back inside the station, Hamish placed Torran's map on the table again. The X seemed heavier now, weighted by the truth it had held. Lugs lay beside the fire, finally relaxing, tail thumping once. Hamish sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. Torran had died frightened, confused, trying to protect truth. Gregor had acted out of fear as well. In Loch Dubh, fear often twisted simple things into tragedies. Hamish looked out at the rain streaking the window. The village would be shaken by this, but it would mend slowly in its own stubborn way. As for him, he felt the familiar loneliness settle over him like a thin shawl, quiet, uninvited, but not unbearable. He glanced at Lugs. "We'll sort the rest tomorrow." Lugs huffed softly, closing his eyes. Outside, the loch rippled under the rain, calm now that its secret had surfaced. The morning came in cautiously, as though it feared to disturb the village after such a heavy night. A fine drizzle hovered over Loch Dubh, falling so lightly it seemed unsure whether to commit to rain or return to mist. The sky wore a soft grey coat, stitched with pale streaks of watery light that did little to warm the earth. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside the station and felt the chill settle instantly into his bones. Lugs padded out after him, shaking droplets from his fur and giving Hamish a pointed look, as if to say the weather ought to behave better at this hour. The village was quiet, too quiet, even for Loch Dubh. The kind of quiet that suggested people were awake behind curtains but unwilling to face the day. Hamish tugged his coat closer around himself and began walking the path that led toward Gregor Watts' croft. Lug stayed pressed to his leg, tail lowered, sensing the mood. The crofts lay in a hushed line beyond the curve of the road. Gregor's croft looked small and tired this morning, its roof glistening with moisture. A coat hung crookedly on the line, sodden from the night before. Gregor himself stood outside, hunched over a pail of water he wasn't really using. When he heard Hamish's boots, he straightened slowly. His shoulders slumped like a man who'd already said all there was to say. "Morning," Hamish said, his voice soft. Gregor swallowed. "You've come to take me, then?" Lug sat at Hamish's feet, staring at Gregor with quiet, dogged certainty. Hamish nodded once. "Aye, it's time we went to Strathbane. The rest is just writing down what you've already told me." For a moment, Gregor looked as if he might argue, then whatever strength he'd been clinging to slipped away. "Right," he murmured. He set the pail aside with clumsy care and wiped his wet hands on his trousers. No sense delaying. They walked together toward the road, Lugs trotting behind them. A few curtains twitched as they passed, faces pale, eyes following, mouths tight with the complicated mixture of pity and relief, Loch Dubh reserved for people who had done wrong, but not wickedly. No one stepped outside. The village watched and kept its distance. The journey to Strathbane was quiet. Grey hills rolled past, washed by rain. Gregor stared at his hands most of the way, as though hoping some different choice might be written there. Lugs dozed lightly in the back, ears twitching at each bump in the road. Hamish drove with his usual steady calm, the kind he used when there was nothing left to argue with but the weather. Strathbane Police Headquarters was its usual unwelcoming self, fluorescent lights that hurt the eyes, stale coffee hanging in the air, and a reception area that always seemed faintly offended by visitors. Blair was waiting, of course, smirk already in place as Hamish led Gregor inside. "About time," Blair crowed. "Macbeth finally brings in his man. I'll take it from here." Hamish didn't bother rising to the bait. "He's ready to make a statement," he said mildly. "You'll find it matches what we've already uncovered in Loch Dubh." Gregor was led away to an interview room. Hamish stayed back, leaning against the wall while Blair's voice carried through now and then in overloud bursts. The details had already been spoken on damp soil beside a crooked fence. Now they were only being translated onto paper and charge sheets. After a time, Daviot appeared, fussing with his tie even though it sat straight. "Macbeth," he said in a low, anxious tone, "I'm told this is a matter of smuggling, panic, and poor judgment, not headlines." "That's right, sir," Hamish replied. "No grand conspiracy, just a frightened man who made bad choices and an old crofter who deserved better." Daviot winced at the bluntness but nodded. "Then we shall keep it quiet. Charges will be brought, of course, but there's no need to feed the press with tales of Highland incompetence." He shot a sharp glance toward Blair. "Do you understand, Sergeant?" Blair deflated a fraction. "Aye, sir." When the formalities were done and Gregor had been taken through the next steps, Hamish collected lugs from the car and headed back out into the rain. Strathbane's hard edges and sour streets fell away behind them as the miles slipped past. Neither man nor dog spoke, only the soft thrum of the engine and the patter of drizzle on the windscreen filled the silence. When Loch Dubh finally came into view, wrapped in a light grey veil of mist, Hamish felt a strange ache of relief. The village looked smaller today, quieter, its secrets laid bare, at least for now. Windows glowed faintly, and somewhere a kettle whistled its thin, lonely note. He parked the Land Rover by the station and stepped out. Lugs followed, shaking rain from his coat. They walked slowly toward the door, passing the crofts where curtains shifted again, though this time the eyes behind them looked more sorrowful than curious. Inside the station, the hearth still held the remains of last night's fire. Hamish knelt and coaxed new flames from the embers. The glow warmed the room, reflecting softly off Lugs's eyes as the dog curled at his feet. Hamish sat back in his chair, letting exhaustion slip into his bones. The case was over, but there was no triumph in it, only the familiar, melancholy knowledge that even gentle places like Lochdub carried burdens, and even gentlemen like Torrin paid prices they should never have had to pay. Outside, the drizzle softened into mist once more. Hamish reached down, resting a hand on Lugs's head. "Good work, boy," he whispered. Lugs pressed closer. The fire crackled, and the loch, hidden beyond the fog, lay still. A quiet melancholy lay over Lochdub, like a shawl too heavy for the morning to lift. Mist drifted in from the loch, soft and low, carrying with it the faint smell of wet stone and last night's rain. The village looked subdued, its colours washed into gentle greys and greens beneath the damp air. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside his station cottage and stood for a moment in the cold, letting the world settle around him. Lugs pressed against his leg, his coat ruffled slightly by a breeze that wandered down from the hills. Across the way, Torrin MacLean's croft stood still and shuttered. The peat smoke that once curled lazily from its chimney had vanished days ago, leaving a cold, empty shape against the moor. Hamish stared at it with a small tightening behind his ribs. Lochdub had lost people before, and would again, but some departures sat heavier than others. Torrin's quiet presence had been part of the landscape. Now the croft looked oddly fragile without him. Hamish walked slowly toward the loch, Lugs trotting beside him with uncharacteristic gentleness. Mist hugged the edges of the water, blurring the reeds and hiding the far bank. Small ripples drifted outward in lazy circles, disturbed only by the occasional fish rising. The storm had passed, leaving behind a restless stillness that seeped into Hamish's bones. He paused by the shore, running a hand through his damp red hair, feeling the weight of unanswered thoughts. Several villagers made their way along the road, speaking in low voices. Mrs. Duff from the hotel carried a bundle of laundry, her face pinched not with irritation but with a kind of sorrow she didn't wish to show. She gave Hamish a small nod as she passed. "A shame, Constable," she murmured. "He was a decent old soul." Hamish nodded. He was. Others followed with quiet greetings, fishermen, crofters, even Jessie and Nessie Curry, though their usual sharp whispers were softened today. The guilt of the village lay unspoken beneath their words. Torrin had been frightened before he died, and Lochdub had allowed gossip to swallow the truth he tried to speak. Hamish turned away from the loch and walked back toward his station cottage. Rain began again, a faint tapping on the rooftops, as though the weather mourned gently alongside them. Inside, the cottage felt colder than usual, the fire having died down to faint embers. He knelt and stirred the peat, coaxing new warmth into the room. The flames rose slowly, casting a soft glow across the cluttered table where Torrin's map still lay. Lug settled near the hearth, curling into a tight ball with his head resting on his paws. His brown eyes lifted to Hamish with a quiet question, as if sensing the heaviness in his thoughts. Hamish reached down and stroked the dog's head. "Aye, boy," he said softly. "I know." He sat back in his worn armchair, letting the heat touch his cold hands. The room flickered with the golden light of the fire, washing the edges of the furniture in warm colour. The hearth had always been a comfort to him, but tonight it felt different, gentler, but tinged with a sadness he couldn't shake. The memory of that strange glow in his bedroom window crept back again, the false light that had led Torrin to fear the worst. "I should have gone sooner," Hamish murmured aloud, though he knew Lugs was the only one to hear him. If I had checked that light the first night, maybe he wouldn't have stayed awake so long. Maybe his heart... His voice trailed off. He didn't finish the thought. Hamish knew well enough that Torrin's heart was already failing. Fear only rushed the moment forward. Lugs rose and nudged his knee with a warm nose. Hamish smiled faintly and scratched behind his ears. "You're right. Brooding won't change things." Outside, the mist thickened again, moving through the village streets like an old visitor with no destination. The faint glow of croft windows flickered in and out as the fog passed. No lanterns shone on the moor tonight, no tricks or reflections dancing across the loch. Whoever had tried to play at lights and shadows had abandoned the effort once the truth came out. Lochdub itself seemed relieved by the quiet. Hamish leaned back, watching the fire breathe gently. His mind drifted to Torrin's final days, the fear in the old man's eyes, the way he'd clutched that map as if it were proof he wasn't mad. Hamish should have listened more closely. He had tried, but Torrhen's worry had been wrapped in hesitation and pride. The old man had believed he was protecting Hamish from unseen danger, when all the while he was the one in peril. Now the cottage felt too big, the night too long. Even the sound of the village, a dog barking far off, a door closing, a kettle whistling faintly through a neighbour's window, felt muted, wrapped in the gentle sadness Loch carried whenever one of its own slipped away. Hamish rose and poured himself a mug of tea. It steamed, curling into the air like a thin ribbon of comfort. He drank slowly, letting the familiar taste warm his chest. Luggs shifted closer, placing his chin on Hamish's foot with a sigh. Across the room, the window caught a faint gleam from the hearth. Not a ghostly reflection, not a trick of metal or mirror, just ordinary light, soft and steady. Hamish watched it for a moment, remembering the nights when it had danced unnaturally. He felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that Flicker would never appear again. He walked to the window and looked out. Mist embraced the far bank where Torrhen's croft stood dark, a silent shape against the moor. No lantern lit its windows. No figure moved across its yard. Only the loch lay between them, calm now, its secrets quiet at last. Hamish rested his forehead lightly against the cold glass. "I'm sorry, Torrhen," he whispered. "You didn't deserve to go frightened." The words dissolved into the mist. He returned to the chair, easing into it with the tiredness of a man who carried more than his share of quiet burdens. The fire crackled softly, adding a gentle rhythm to the evening. Luggs lifted his head briefly, then settled again. Hamish poked the peat with the iron rod, watching sparks drift upward like tiny wandering stars. He felt the familiar solitude close around him, not painful, but not pleasant either. Just part of his life, part of who he was. A man who cared too much, perhaps, and said too little. A man who walked the loch paths in the dark to protect people who rarely realised how much protecting they needed. The drizzle thickened to rain, pattering on the roof in a steady hush. Hamish listened, letting it wash the edges from his thoughts. Tonight was not a night for worries or guilt. Torran was gone, and no amount of thinking would change the course of things. But there was a gentleness in accepting that truth, the way the Highlands always asked for acceptance after a storm. Accept the loss, accept the quiet that followed. He leaned forward and stroked Luggs's head again. "We'll manage, old fellow," he murmured. "Same as always." Luggs thumped his tail once, the faint sound somehow comforting in the dim room. Hamish let his gaze drift again to the soft glow of the hearth. The firelight shimmered against the stones, steady and warm, replacing the memory of the eerie reflection that had haunted his window. This light was honest, human, the kind that belonged to crofters and constables, not to shadows playing tricks on frightened minds. Lochdub's night deepened, but the cottage stayed gently lit, and for the first time in many nights, Hamish felt the heavy knot in his chest loosen, just enough to breathe properly. The false light was gone, but the real one, this small, warm glow of home, remained.